Hello and a very warm welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm very pleased to introduce our event this afternoon with Preti Taneja and Nandini Das. Preti Taneja is a writer and activist. Her novel, We That Are Young, won the 2018 Desmond Elliott Prize for the UK's Best Debut of the Year, and was listed for awards including the Folio Prize, the Shakti Bhatt First Book Prize in India, the Republic of Consciousness Prize in the UK, and Europe's premier award for a work of world literature, the Prix Jan Michalski. It was Book of the Year in The Guardian, The Sunday Times, The Spectator, and a top 10 book of the decade for India's The Hindu newspaper. It has been translated into 7 languages and is published in the USA by AA Knopf. For those who haven't yet had the chance to read it, We That Are Young is a retelling, or a translation, I think Preti called it, of King Lear as a critique of the legacies of British imperialism and contemporary Hindu fascism in India. Preti teaches creative writing at Newcastle University. She's a contributing editor at the White Review and at the Independent Press and Other Stories. Her new book, Aftermath, on the language of trauma, terror, prison, and abolition, will be published later this year as part of the Undelivered Lecturers series from Transit Books. Nandini Das is a literary and cultural historian and professor of early modern literature and culture at the University of Oxford, as well as the director of the TIDE project. Nandini has written and presented programs on television and radio for the BBC on cabinets of curiosities, Shakespeare, Renaissance travel, and histories of immigration, as well as the literature and popular culture of 16th and 17th century England. So Nandini and Preti, over to you.
Thank you, Lorraine, for that lovely introduction. And hello, everyone. Welcome to the second event of TIDEfest, our weekend's cultural festival around the stories that we tell about identity, about belonging, about race. And you may have already caught our first event this morning with writers Nikesh Shukla, Kate Williams, and teachers Hannah Cusworth and Wendy Lennon. But now it gives me great pleasure to have this conversation, this opportunity to talk again to Preti as a friend, colleague, and co-conspirator who's been wonderfully inspirational for the work that TIDE has been doing over the last few years. Today, Preti and I will talk about her writing and the work she has done with TIDE. You will also get a chance to watch a bit of the TIDE Salon, which is the online digital installation that Preti designed and helped to create. And you will also get a chance to hear Preti read. We will set aside some time for your questions later on, so please store them up as we go along, and you'll be able to put them in the question section on Crowdcast for us. Preti, welcome. For so many of us who read We That Are Young, I still remember my first moment, reading the opening chapter of your book, and being struck by the brilliance of both its style and its voice. And something that I kept thinking about is how wonderfully you played with multiplicity and discomfort often within that book. And I wondered if we could start there. Would you read a bit from the novel for us as an opener?
I'd be delighted. And thank you, Lorraine, for the kind introduction, and Nandini for having me as writer in residence for TIDE in 2020. Is probably the strangest year not to be anywhere except your own house, while also resident somewhere else for this project. I'm going to read from the very beginning almost of We That Are Young, and I have here in my hands the original first edition of the book, which was limited, in fact, when it first came out. So, because the actual material thing of the book is quite important to the TIDE project, I thought I would read from this copy. There will be no future for Jeevan Singh in the company because looking stupid is his new career. He has become the official entertainment for the drivers and garage boys who cannot understand where he wants to go. Can you take me to Ranjit's house in Nizamuddin, old house? He mimes a driving motion, thinks about trying in Hindi but does not. Wants to demand the keys for the Ferrari, the Maserati. Somewhere in this garage must be the vintage Rolls that old Nannu was driven around in when he was a boy. He was not allowed near it. If he even breathed near it, she would threaten to give Gargi a slap. The car belonged to her husband, the Maharaja of Naparthala. Ma said it was the only thing alongside Nannu to survive the Maharaja's love of dice. A man in a grey and gold uniform approaches, and the other drivers let him through. His head is so round, he looks like the letter I. I am Dipesh Singh, chief mechanic here. Jeevan Sir Ranjit Ji's bungalow is on the farm only. Your bag has been delivered. I will request an escort for you. No, I want to go to Unka Ghar. Ranjit's home? Jeevan mimes four walls around his face, a roof. He watches closely. Does his rusted Hindi raise the chief mechanic's brows, the corner of his mouth? Yes, sir. Praveen? A boy with hair as shiny as a bowling ball steps forward. Chalo, take Mr. Ranjit to Ranjit Sahib's bungalow. Jeevan allows them to put him in the back of another golf cart. They pass the bowling green, the pool again. He keeps his eyes closed, head back. It takes around 10 minutes. They don't talk. They come to a gated section where 3 discrete bungalows form sides around a well-kept green. Each has a tidy veranda, complete with a cut glass table and low beanbags slung around. Each one has flower boxes in the windows. They pull up. The boy hands him an envelope, says, "Sir, that one." He gestures to the central house. "Here, your personalized card key." He starts the cart. He whistles as he steers away. On the veranda, a wrinkled woman in mud-coloured sari squats with a long cane brush. She does not look up, just sweeps around Jeevan, moving like a crab. Wild, he thinks. That's wild. Inside, the temperature is controlled. Dark wood, glass and porcelain, down lighting and more lilies. Everything embossed with a company logo, a shield, 2 tigers, 2 snakes, 2 mottos, one in Latin and one in Sanskrit or Hindi. He cannot guess language or meaning. The only word he recognizes is beverage.
That is so wonderful, Preti. And you know, the thing that strikes me in there is the way you take us through visual perceptions as well as linguistic ones. And the one thing that I hadn't noticed before was how wonderful that word wild is in that context. It just perfectly generationally pins Jeevan down to a T in a way.
Yeah, I think for me, the way that language makes pictures is really important, and the way in which we kind of have these frames of reference or frames of representation almost in our minds through the prism of language. So when he says wild, one can read it as him saying that's very strange. And that word strange is something I guess we'll be talking about quite a lot today. But obviously the wildness happens to him in this space of ultra civilization where everything is controlled right down to the temperature and, you know, where he's allowed to walk and who gets to sweep the floor. And, you know, so there's this kind of play on the potential of this language to be read in lots of different ways.
That's really interesting, actually, also for me, because one of the things that I'm fascinated by is the way that your novel and you take us from London. So your novel opens with Jeevan flying out of Heathrow, that wonderful scene, looking down and arriving in India. But then there's so many layers of opaqueness there as well, like in that logo, the Latin and the Sanskrit, isn't there? The kind of opportunity for misreading.
There's a lot that this character has lost. If you know King Lear, you know it opens with the coming home of an exiled son who has been away for a while. So in many ways, Shakespeare gives us the chance to enter into this strange feudal world of the Lear universe, the Lear family and the court, through the eyes of a stranger, an outsider, which, you know, gave me the chance to construct this young man who had been in America from India, all the time in which India has been changing massively through the 90s. So his whole growing up, he's been exiled in America, and then he's coming home and he's expecting to be this Western conquering hero. But instead, he's just completely wrong-footed by how far this democracy has moved forward, while he's been, you know, thinking of himself as a sort of a better than them. And, you know, when he comes back, he has to negotiate all of these different layers of things he's lost. And one of those things is a traditional upbringing where he would have been able to basically decipher the Hindi from the Sanskrit. I mean, they're two separate languages. They're like, they have roots in each other, but you know, and if you can read in one, you can pretty much decipher what's going on in the other. But I think for him, all of this is opaque, just as it is for anybody not from India, coming back there who hasn't had that grounding. So he gives us this opportunity to think through what authenticity really is, and whether or not we need it, what interpretation offers us, and also to see with him our own sense of being displaced from what we consider to be the center, because he is now in a center where he is not the center, where he has been in America all this time.
Exactly. But there's the other thing about Jeevan, of course, is there's that sense of perception, isn't it? In a way, he looks like the people who are surrounding him, but he isn't really. So there's that sense of where does difference lie? And I'm thinking because you know, Lear is of course an overwhelming presence behind it. And sometimes that idea of how much we identify a text, a response to Shakespeare, takes on very similar resonances about, you know, is it different? Is it similar? How much do we read a text through our expectations about Shakespeare, rather than as a text per se? And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your relationship with Shakespeare.
Well, it's interesting you put it that way, because I did not come to this play of Lear with any expectations of Shakespeare. Of course, by the time I encountered King Lear, I was 17, I was doing A-levels, it's on the national curriculum, I had a great teacher, and I was talked about this in other places. But the specificity of your question is interesting to me, because when I think about it now, you know, I had Charles and Mary Lamb, which is, you know, the child Shakespeare. I had a sense of Shakespeare-ness in the ether, but I had never read any criticism of Lear before I read the play. And I came at it very much as a reader who was, I was a book child, so I was constantly reading. And every text for me, I was looking for meaning. I was looking for meaning for myself and my place in the world and my own emotions. And, you know, I was very intense reader, as many writers turn into from that. And I think I came to this play and I just had my mind bent, snapped, reformed by the way the words worked and what the story behind the story was. It happened to be that, you know, one thing I really like about the TIDE project, and I think is so important about the TIDE project, is the work that is going on to reframe how partition is taught in schools. If I had been taught partition in school, I don't know whether or not this play would have had so much resonance for me, because literature in this case filled the void in the education system, which did not allow me to see my history authenticated in the classroom. And it was a history I had orally from my mother, from my aunts, my grandmother's resistance to coming to England. She never would come here if she could help it, because she simply hated what had happened to her, particularly in partition. She was a young bride in 1947. She was pregnant with my mother. They moved from Lahore. They, you know, locked up their home and so on in Lahore, and they moved with the great migration of people to Delhi. So it was a very personal history, but it felt like science fiction. And it felt like it didn't really have validity, because no one ever talked about it in school. And school for sort of young brown wool is like the holy temple of where you have to prove yourselves. So it mattered, it mattered hugely to suddenly come across this play where, oh, right, okay, Shakespeare knew that kingdoms got divided. Shakespeare knew that fathers and daughters have this kind of public relationship where you have to show your obedience to the family unit and to the father in particular, which felt very Indian to me, or South Asian. It felt, very, very resonant that there was a daughter who was the eldest. And I had seen this even in like modest middle-class Indian households, where the woman of the house basically was run frantic all day, trying to organize everybody else's life. And it never felt quite fair because obviously, you grow up in the West and you have a certain amount of freedom and autonomy, and my mother went out to work and all sorts of things. So there was many ways in which this play filled a gap and a bridge, and it became something that I thought about morality through and thought about fairness through, and it never was from the point of view of Lear. So when I came to critical work about it, I was already distrustful of a narrative that said, this is a tragic hero story, a man more sinned against than sinning. It never felt like it rang true for me. And obviously I noticed that most of the major critics of centuries of criticism of Shakespeare were men. I was just looking at it through a different lens.
That's really interesting, and particularly the point you make about literature and Shakespeare in this case, offering you something that silences in history, whether it's taught in schools or whether it's in our public discourse, didn't. Because that's something I remember from our initial discussions when you were poised to come on board as our visiting writer in 2020. I remember talking to you about our own struggles as critics and historians within the project, about what to do with those silences. And I wondered if we could talk a little bit about that, if we can cast our minds back to those initial conversations that you and I had when we started working together within TIDE, and what interested you in the kind of wrestling with history and wrestling with literature that we were doing.
I'm fascinated by curatorial systems and archives, and obviously the TIDE project, especially through keywords, it brought together so many things that I'm interested in, including how language changes over time and its usage. But it was more for me to do with the way that the archive can repeat itself, or the ways that silences in the archive can be reperpetrated, because if we're only using that one archive, we're only as good as the material we have. And so I was interested as visiting writer to get to grips with who was making TIDE the final finished things, the keywords, the case studies of figures from the period that TIDE deals with. What biases were they bringing? What knowledge and openings were they making? What was being missed even at this level of a contemporary moment? And how might a writer working creatively fill those gaps? What could we do with them? I think that's where I engaged with the project.
And of course, one of the issues with TIDE was that we were looking at, and we are still looking at, a period that is relatively less discussed in terms of those encounters between the home and the world, what is familiar and what is strange. So we're looking at the pre-empire world. And as you said, our first challenge was this idea of keywords, the words that kept cropping up in the discussions on the streets, in the parliament, in the house, in the church of 16th and 17th century England, at a point where England was still not quite sure about its place on the global, kind of in terms of global geopolitics, and was trying to figure out its identity, where it stood, what it meant by even simple terms like a citizen of England, who belonged, who didn't.
Right, and somehow at some point in the ways that nationalism gets solidified through curation of stories, the decision was made that that period and that aspect of that period would get submerged. because here we are trying to excavate it from something that has taken, you know, centuries of like layer upon layer of different types of focus, different stories being focused on, different histories being promoted, different histories being taught, until you get to the point where, you know, the psychological impact of that on the most recent arrivals is that they have to recreate everything that happened back then all over again. And so we can never fully find our footing, we can never find that home until I think we make those links with our own pasts and their shared pasts. It's a quite radical political project in its own way.
Excavation is a really interesting word, isn't it, that you used about re-excavating those histories, because it plays that idea of rediscovery, re-excavation, of, you know, brushing away the dust from things that have been buried, is so much a part of TIDE Salon itself.
Right, yeah. I mean, the TIDE Salon is a product of its contemporary moment. There was no thought in our minds when we first started talking about what I would produce as visiting writer, that we were going to build this interactive multimedia installation, because we thought we were going to do something live. We thought we were going to bring these 6 spoken word artists and 6 musicians together for half a day to work with the keywords and formulate some workshops and pieces of music that would then be performed in the evening to an audience in a very, very intimate chor style, like a salon, basically. You know, imagine low cushions and a sort of dhaba, and, you know, that you can have your chai and you can listen to this amazing music and hear a conversation between words and music, which takes forward into another language, those Thai keywords, which is kind of what I wanted to do. But then, of course, everything shut down, and we became kind of forced in a way to think more about the potential of the 21st century to offer us different ways of thinking, and instead I decided that this project would go online, and we would try to find a way not just to present, you know, in a very brief, fleeting moment of experience for a live audience, the process of art making between the spoken word artists and the musicians with the keywords, but try to build an archive so that people could discover it and experience it for themselves. And we did that online using a really interesting digital form. It's not really a website, it's more like an interactive multimedia installation. That's exactly what it is, where layers of meaning are made through one's own journey through this archive. And you will come across Zoom calls that the artists had with each other or with me, or with Nandini. You'll come across fragments of their WhatsApp messages. You'll come across music samples, almost like drafts of their texts. And you'll come across fragments that I wrote for the salon, which frame the whole thing as if you are a researcher in an archive in a future time. So the whole thing takes on this futurity. It's not really about the present. It was made in the present, but it's set somewhere far in the future, where canons are different. Shakespeare's been forgotten. Walter Benjamin, the great translator, theorist, humanitarian, is a sort of footnote, and different voices have risen in that meantime space. Some words have fallen out of meaning, and I just had a lot of fun with it, because there were lots of hours in the lockdown to do that.
That's right. I remember when we first started talking about it, and started talking to our principal funders for that particular project, the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities, Torch. Our thinking was very much in terms of the transience of an event, that this was going to be a one-off event, a one-off conversation among all of these voices that we were trying to capture. But by the end of it, as the project grew and transformed itself over the lockdown, it became more of a struggle to how to capture those transient conversations, isn't it? And as a researcher, I found that deeply moving and thought-provoking, I think, because for those of us who are looking at that period, that pre-empire period, 16th and 17th centuries, so often what we come across are those fragments. So we might venture into an archive, we might venture into a regional county records office and find a book, a handwritten manuscript, which has a list of all the strangers who've been baptized in a particular village church. And in those little kind of tables with little scribbles that we have to painstakingly decipher, and sometimes we can't quite decipher because sometimes people frankly had terrible handwriting, even in that period, there are fragments of lives. And there's no way for us to follow up on those lives, but there's no way for us to fully understand the heft and the weight of the human emotions that lie behind those rapidly scribbled words about so-and-so, you know, Peter Indian baptized at this church on this winter evening. What happened to him? How did he get here? Is he Indian at all? Is he of a different country? So many questions.
Right, and I think for me that awareness that nothing lasts is so saturated in King Lear. Everything about that play is about some kind of eschatological end time moment where we have to realize that nothing, all that in the book, in the novel, it's this little sentence, all will fall. And, you know, it's that awareness that no matter, and it gives our own lives a sense of being quite frantic, because we are always fighting against this entropy of decay. And it feels to me that as a writer, because I sort of think, if I can keep pushing at the possibilities of what that means imaginatively, then I can imagine a world in which Shakespeare doesn't really have any heft anymore. I can imagine a world in which our own work has crumbled into these fragments, almost like Sappho has, and Sappho is a big influence on the fragments that I wrote, where the resonance of our technology, like I'm very analog when it comes to my writing. In one sense, I don't work kind of straight onto paper, but I still use a very basic Word program. But the fragment brackets consider revising of Word, where it spell checks your grammar and it spell checks, and it's trying to kind of flatten out the way everybody writes, so it's quite uniform, is both sinister and full of potential. And so that idea of a fragment that can be revised, and the question of time's revolution, which is so central to Shakespeare and central to the way Hinduism works through dharma as well, which sort of saturates the novel. All of these things kind of came together with the potential of this technology that I wanted to use to build the TIDE Salon, and the way in which it became a story. So it is really framed as this archive that people stumble into from light years ahead of us.
But there's also something else about it, isn't there? Because of the nature of the fragments, and because of the way you play with that fragmentary nature of what might remain, the role of interpretation, the role of knowledge forming, you know, the knowledge that we make. Sometimes I think, particularly today in current discourse, we tend to forget that there isn't a single history that is transparently kind of communicated through us, through all these documents that have survived through the years, that each of those pieces of paper or book or, you know, moth-eaten artifact has multiple histories, multiple ways of looking at it from different perspectives. And sometimes all of those perspectives can be valid. Sometimes all of them can be deeply wrong. All we can do is try to find out which narrative might make sense. And that's partly something that I feel like perhaps it comes through to me very strongly in We That Are Young as well, that dissonance, or perhaps a sense of the gap of empathy or understanding between what has passed, what is here. But at the same time, perhaps there is also a possibility of reaching out beyond that.
Yeah, I've had the privilege of having to reflect quite deeply on what's going on in my novel, technically. And I think, you know, when I was writing it, it came out in a set. I didn't set out with like, I want to do this, I want to do this. It just was what I did. But as I've been able to reflect on it quite a lot in the last 4 years since it's been out for various reasons, on panels or academic journals or talks or whatever, and amazing questions from people all over the world, I've managed to kind of get to grips with the inner workings of my own brain in a way. It's like not particularly healthy perhaps, but I think for me, you know, putting things side by side matters, and radical doubt is really where I find my writing and my own sense of excitement in writing. I think I really want to write as if I'm like on the edge of my own cliff of trust. And what I mean by that is I'm always trying to push at the limits of meaning, but also, you know, just to show you what I mean in We That Are Young, there's a lot of text and intertextuality with Hindu ancient texts. There's a critique of fascism in the way that the laws of Manu, for example, are interpreted in the novel, which are the founding legal texts of Hinduism. And there's also a constant emphasis on other ways of reading those canonical texts. And by other, I mean resistant to fascism, resistant to binaries of identity, syncretic voices like Kabir, for example, or interpretations of the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita and so on, which embrace equality and embrace transness of all kinds, not just gender, but thought, or not only gender, in a way that Hinduism used to hold within it, or South Asian syncretic culture used to hold within it, which is being lost. It's being destroyed materially in the destruction of religious mosques and, you know, other monuments. It's being lost through the erasure of languages and school textbooks. History is being rewritten all over the place. These ways of thinking about who we want to be in 100 years depend on who's controlling what culture we are exposed to. And that is a political mode. So for me to write something about all of these things using Shakespeare's canonical play, King Lear, means I have to put it in a conversation with its kind of fascistic counterparts in India, but also find ways to undermine those at the same time through the text and through interpretations of those texts, which say, actually, these texts will not fall into one meaning. And they can't be interpreted in only one way that's going to shape all of the young people to be a certain kind of militaristic, violent, anti-Muslim, for example, being later on in 10 years' time, because this isn't just about, you know, going to war against people with weapons. It's about words. And I think we know that in this country just as well as people do in Brazil or India or in America.
It's also something about comfort and discomfort, isn't it? As human beings, perhaps we feel unsure about residing in uncertainties, in multiplicities. We find single stories far more comfortable to narrate, to navigate in some ways. And there seems to be a drive increasingly, but particularly when it comes to the stories we tell through history, to reduce those multiplicities to a single narrative in some ways that, like you said, could be, you know, put forward to the next generations. But that's where I think TIDE Salon is really interesting, because of the way you conceptualized that playing with those fragments we have shored up against our ruins, so to say, those bits that we recover and what the stories we tell from that. But before we talk, I'd love to talk to you a little bit more about that, Preti. But before we do that, shall we try to have a look at the trailer for TIDE Salon, just to give our audience a little bit of an idea of the tone and nature of it?
Yeah, that would be great. We should say as well that these trailers, they're like little films, and so they don't really give you the sense of the interactivity, and that's where technology sort of breaks down, because it doesn't work on Zoom for us to show it to you interactively. But I hope you'll go to the website of the salon and go in it and have a look around.
Exactly. Hopefully the tech team will be able to drop in a link to the TIDE Salon on Crowdcast. But let's have a look at the trailer.
Here she swoops, in acceptance of every part of herself, where nothing is foreign.
If I'm an alien, then you're an alien to me. If I'm a stranger, then you're a stranger to me.
You know, Preti, every time I've watched this so many times, and we've mulled over the TIDE Salon website for months, but I still feel excited when I see that trailer.
There's something about the music and Miss Mohammed's amazing vocals, and the whole thing just came together. It was like a dream collaboration between some just extraordinary artists. Yeah, I feel the same way when I watch it.
Do you think you might talk a little bit about the process and the artists who kind of delivered this so wonderfully?
Sure, they're all, I worked with a curator called Sweetie Kapoor and a filmmaker, artist, an artist filmmaker called Ben Crow, who built the site and conceived it really with all the visuals. And really for me, it was about making process visible. So we asked them to just keep a log of and send us all of their conversations that they were having on WhatsApp, because obviously they couldn't meet to make the collaborations. And we had sent them TIDE keywords for them to look through and choose in pairs what they wanted to respond to. And in the end, they chose stranger, alien, and traveler as these three words. And each pair made a piece of music on words, which then you can hear the full, complete collaborations in the TIDE Salon. You can watch it with videos, you can watch it without.
And of course, we paired up a spoken word artist with a musician for each of them, didn't we?
Right. So Dana, Miss Mohammed, worked with Sarathi Kawar, who has a great show on world music on the radio, and he's an awesome musician. The two of them together just created, they'd never worked together before, but you can go in there and find out how they built their sound. And Dana's got some Trinidadian roots, so she talks about the kind of like the steel drum sound you can hear as sort of tire hubcaps and things that she uses to make this noise. And it's very resonant for people, but you also can just enjoy it as a fine piece of music, which was the point, really. You know, you don't have to know all of the subtext. You don't have to know how to read all of the intertext, especially in my work as well. Like, you can just read it and enjoy it, and in its mystery. So it allows you to embrace doubt in that sense too.
And there was also the elements that the artists brought in with them. I still remember with another of the pairings where Steve Chandra Savale and Zia Ahmed, the prize-winning poet and spoken word artist, when they were talking about their chosen word, which was alien or stranger, my initial conversation with them was all about how that word alien meant something very different in the 16th and 17th centuries from what it means now. Where we talk about foreigners, 16th and 17th century English people would talk about the alien. For them, the foreigner was someone domestic, someone who had just moved from different part of England to another part, perhaps.
Right.
But when Steve was talking about it, for him, that also brought in memories of growing up as an immigrant child, essentially, looking beyond England, looking beyond the reality around him to science fiction for those kind of encounters. And
right.
that seeps into that.
He shared that with us, didn't he? He shared all of his kind of love of science fiction and these kind of 1970s movies and graphic novels that he had been influenced by, but also some very political imagery of people queuing outside immigration offices to get right to remain and so on back in the 80s and 90s. And, you know, as part of Asian Dub Foundation, he's been just so formative in pushing the boundaries of saying against this idea that there should only be one story, because the music that he's been involved in throughout his career has been about hybridity and embracing and celebrating hybridity and just refusal to be categorized. And I think, you know, he brought so much historical knowledge to the TIDE Salon. He's like a real mentor to the others as well in that sense. But even he found that I think what happens is when we actually find the roots in history and documents of some of the unease that we feel about being who we are in the contemporary moment, suddenly a lot of things make sense. And it can be quite healing in a way, but it can stoke your outrage that you didn't know this before. It can fuel your sense that you have to keep working as artists to try to keep making space. And it also reminds you that, you know, this kind of curation, silencing that we're talking about, it makes you think you're alone. It forces you into a position where you internalize this sense that perhaps you're not quite right. It is not society that's not right, it's you that, and when we started to kind of read the keywords, talk amongst ourselves as a collaboration, that sense of coming together to make something is fundamental to the politics of TIDE Salon. It is really about strength in numbers and critical mass and understanding our myriad stories against this single narrative that's grown up over time. And it starts with kind of this essence, which is excavation, which we were talking about earlier.
It also makes you realize, I think you absolutely hit the nail on the head about that sense of isolation that sometimes these discourses generate. It makes you feel like you're alone, not just in terms of your community, but also historically, that our generations are the first ones encountering something, and it crops up repeatedly in public discourse and public debate about how earlier periods were different. You know, the past really is a foreign country and people did things differently there. But one of the things that, of course, that kept cropping up, and I remember talking to the artists involved about this, is how vociferous sometimes public discourse was in the 16th and 17th century, grappling exactly with those ideas of identity, about belonging, about, say, the rights of migrants in London, about humanity that bounds us rather than national boundaries, or faith or language.
Right, or even just skin color. You know, Zia, you know, he's an amazing poet, and he's quite, if I might say, he's also young, you know, and he's fighting these battles on a daily basis just because of the way in which policing and surveillance works in our cities. And he's going out on the street and he's trying to be himself, and he's pouring all of his energy and political resistance and rage into his writing in a way that suggests that this work never happened before him. And that just tells you everything you need to know about the way the state controls ideas of who a stranger is, who an alien is, and how it's rooted in this language that comes from way back centuries ago. And when he starts to put those pieces together, a different sense of community arises, a different network, a different safety net, and a new confidence to basically say, I am what I think, you know, I discovered in your archive, John Florio called a third thing. And that's okay. And that is exciting. And I want to see what work comes out of that. So really, that's where all of this has been going.
Now, listen, the main thing that held all of these conversations and exchanges together, as our audience will be able to see on the TIDE Salon installation, of course, are the fragments that you created in a way. So I wonder, Preti, if you could explain that concept, where you came from in devising these fragments a bit, and would you be able to read us a little bit from them?
Yes, I will read something of them, and I'm going to share my screen in just a minute so you can see them, because the way they look on the page is really important to how you experience them, and you can find them inside the salon when you go looking for them.
Right, I'm going to magically disappear from the screen in that case.
You wanted me to say something about how they came about, and I think just to pick up on some of the things I've mentioned, first of all, I was just really interested in the people who made up the TIDE project. And some of those are with us today, Loren working, Emily Stevenson, a couple of other people who were not here, Nandini herself. So them as scholars and as researchers, as excavators, they appear in this. If you read, you'll see their names referred to as some kind of sideways glances. The idea of visiting this thing from far in the future is really what frames it. There's lots of intertextuality. It kind of characterizes all the things I write. And that's for very political reasons, the things I choose to work with in various different pieces. And Shakespeare obviously is part of that, but in this set of fragments doesn't quite make it into the canon anymore. So that's the basics, and I'm going to share my screen and read. There are 3 fragments. They kind of link together, and they also finally arose out of they were the very last piece of TIDE Salon that we made. I listened to all of the material that the 3 pairs sent me and Ben, and I had eavesdropped on all these conversations that they had on Zoom and WhatsApp and so on. So the fragments came out of everything at the very end, and then suddenly it all came together. So here we go with the share screen. Archivist Notes, Part of 3, found in Archive, Human Era 2020, folder Digital Debris, translated by Algorithm BC in the year Eliana 3096. Filed under U, keyword, unfinished, underexamined, unheimlich, unhomed, title, fragment, consider revising. Reference found, a command frequently made by the dominant linguistic training program Word, in use worldwide during the final years. Key to symbols, a single square bracket pertains to missing matter. Fragment, consider revising. You write to me as Benjamin, you want to make this work. You come to me and are restless, you call me Aliena in your sleep. My name is Celia in my white girl dreams. My whisper name is Prithvi, I am transparent in your arms. I am naked, brown and soft, as a certain kind of sugar, as Sappho to the Greeks. Fragment, consider revising. Archivist notes, whether she herself was literate is unknown. The sense of her desire is as uncivil. We recall that the task of the translator consists in finding that intended effect upon the language into which he is translating, which produces in it the echo of the original. Unlike a world of literature, work of literature, translation does not find itself in the center of the language forest, but on the outside. It calls into it without entering, aiming at that single spot where the echo is able to give in its own language the reverberation of the work in the alien one. W. Benjamin, source lost. Now let us examine your own hand. Now let us examine your hand on me. Hand me on, hand me inside, hand inside me. You're stranger than, you're estranged to your mouth. Consent with both that we may enjoy each other. Archivist note, match to quote found, file under script title ASYL, possibly an abbreviation of the defunct citizenship category, asylum, author unknown. You are in the bookshop, I am here. You long for me and listen for me. You read me when no one is looking. My book lies in your hands, open at a page that moves you. I think it moves you to read it again and again. I remember a moment between us. I remember how I made my declaration of love, mistaken in the body as desire. I remember you saying to me, look for the higher ground. You turned away as if we had not spent another life together. You turned away as if I had always been a stranger to you and not the yearning in yourself. During my research, I read a scholar's marginalia. She was named for a tree, for a bird, and for wisdom. She was named Lorraine. Though this feels somewhat artificially ordered, since my notes are scattered on scraps of paper, post-it notes, napkins, notebooks, wrappers, margins, I wondered if you'd ever come across me here, there, or here. Fragment, consider revising. There was that time we walked around a monumental library. There were books held in glass cases, become as objects in a museum. I remember wanting nothing but to break. I remember you weren't hungry, but we ate the rest out of home. And we talked about love in a language no one else could understand and in voices only we could hear. You called me Aliena, it sounded stranger in your mouth. You called me strange, and I said, my name is Aliena, and I wanted to confess. I will come again. All men are but strangers and pilgrims here on earth, searching for their native land, not recognizing it here. Archivist note, the page is torn, the page is burned as if there was an urgent interruption. Only remnants are left. Police beat, chastised, the church, the saints, the month of August turning red, baptized in the water, bitter on the tongue. Like recognition, like is the thing with, like. This is for Lacan, the future mind. This is for his father, researcher, revisitor who cannot sleep. There was also tomorrow, let us call it Tom. There was also love and waterboarding. All of these fragments, these researches, this taste, recherché, à la temps perdu. Archivist notes, part 3 of Found in Archive, Human Era 2020, folder, Digital Debris, translated by Algorithm BC in the year Aliena 3095. Filed under H, keyword, Hakluit, homeward, hidden, heard, hope, hem. Title, fragment, consider revising. Reference found, a command frequently made by the dominant linguistic training program Word, in use worldwide during the final years. Key to symbols, a single square bracket pertains to missing matter. 2, fragment, consider revising. Your name is Emily, you do a search for Amelia. Amelia does not know herself except as a dash, as an M dash, as across oceans, jewels hidden in her hems. Traveller dust rises into refraction of light, prismatic formation of water on eyelashes. Blink towards the psionic future. Blink, Emily, blink. This time will be yours, and we will call you as Revathy. All the worlds you remember are gone. Beautiful, bare naked traveller, these lines are written for your nomadic eye, in the state of untravelling. The way I write to you is oral. The print will unravel as a thread. This fascinating process, your bare feet, your clothes, your mask, has a label on it, Navigazioni, and your hair smells of star anise, the spice root, and the sea. I always wanted to be the miniature painter at the Mughal court, and reduced to simplicity in perspective and frame. I am too expressive. I am told. I am only visible when you look for me. I have to get out of here. I am the lover. I am alive. Fragment, consider revising. And I really like etymology anyway. The sound of Akbar in dreams, the traveller, working the chain of meaning so you can be. In labour, in revolution, free of lyric shame, deep in the body of Revathy as you like it to be. And while you have been reading, 27 Jatara Yuga have passed. Now what are you still nostalgic for? Do you want more ghee? We are walking towards a fourth space, your pixelated dreams, where women rejecting sindoor embrace fulfillment, separated before birth by 1947, by 1971, now born across, now in time, where we can meet. Archivist note 2, the only reference to Amelia Revathy found in 2 epic texts, one in a fragment of script from the human era 17th century English, one in the lost language of the human era known as Sanskrit, of which only letters that evoke certain sounds now remain. Archivist notes 3. For fourth space and references, see threads by Sandeep Paramani Shiramaya and Bharani Kapil in file Human Era 2018, folder Philosophy, Text, Canon. Archivist note part 3 of Found in Archive, Human Era 2020, folder Digital Debris, translated by Algorithm BC in the year Eliana 3095. Filed under L, liminal, liar, likable, lozenge, language, liver, library, libation. See also intoxication, liberation. Title, fragment, consider revising. Reference found, a command frequently made by the dominant linguistic training program Word, in use worldwide during the final years. Key to symbols, a single square bracket pertains to missing matter. Fragment, consider revising. They say the savage is almost a human who longs for something lost, has forgotten their father who cannot spell son whose name is lost. They say the savage came over here crawling, legs wide open, whose body is hair, who has never known laughter, who cannot spell daughter, whose shame is lost. In the Middle French savage, where the spaces beyond human control, ships set out, now in line, column, in row, rank, file, a great game being played, as clerks we lost. The English were afraid their language was the savage compared to the Italian. They turn tide on us, the sounds we make, our children weep as BAME are lost. Savage is unnatural and inhuman. Shakespeare means women and dark matter. Inhuman means punishment for the fall. So says the religion that came with the lost. Savage is a natural, innocent being. The French philosophers write for égalité. Nature is as nature survives. Will Eliana's voice or Montaigne's be lost? Eventually, savage changes face with native, sitting up at high table with bone china tea, teaching sounds, teaching syntax, teaching snuff to tame our minds till they're lost. They say, look, we have one or two here, that's to be grateful for, that's certainly so. Now we can spell grateful, obedient, modest, our ancestral flame blown out, lost. They call this an archive. An archive is whatever falls into an envelope. The rest of the letters can be framed as lost. The origin of this guzzle was a guzzle. This is not a true guzzle, the poet protests. The form is corrupted, the form is savage. Is the form lost? The train is lost. The biggie, the beautiful, the touch, the divine, the tongue, the heart, the lips. The question of winning has no answer. Knowing this truth, any game is lost. Don't you recognize me? I will admit it. I like my mangoes juicy and sweet. In you, Shahid, the rain, I am lost. Archivist note 2, va, va. Archivist note 3. This fragment is one of the most complete of Eliana's works to survive the final years. As an example of Eliana's style, it can be considered classic, with themes of love, longing, sexual desire, and speaking as if from a submissive position in history, also with reference to names of what are assumed to be her friends or colleagues, here Shakespeare, Montaigne, and sometimes appearing to be in conversation with other writers, see note 4. Archivist note 4, Shahid, trans witness in Arabic or English, beloved Persian, English, could also refer to Agha Shahid Ali, Kashmiri poet, writer of the Human Era, born 1949 to 2001, authority on the ghazal, a poetic form of the Human Era 7th century, Arabic, Persian, Urdu, English. See, for example, they asked me to tell them what Shahid means. Listen, it means the beloved in Persian, witness in Arabic. Agha Shahid Ali, source text, ghazal, in file, Human Era, 20 to 21st century, span, folder, philosophy, text, canon. Notable lines, the other question remains, if one writes in free verse, and one should, to subvert Western civilization, surely one should write in forms to save oneself from Western civilization? Agha Shahid Ali, source text unknown. In file, Human Era, 20 to 21st century, span, folder, text, philosophy, canon. Notable lines, the thirst for unity haunts the Westerner. Agha Shahid Ali, source text unknown. In file, Human Era, 20 to 21st century, span, folder, philosophy, text, canon.
That is just wonderful, Preti. Thank you so much for reading that for us. There are so many things to pick up from there. I'm still moved, actually, by that. You've made me lose track of the questions I wanted to ask you.
It's all about getting lost.
It is, isn't it? One of the things that struck me really early on was this wonderful phrase you had, which was something about books in glass cases held as objects in a museum. And then later on, your fragments continue to grapple with that idea, isn't it, about the lives of books and texts themselves.
I'm always, you can go around to very eminent libraries in different parts of the world and university collections and private collections and see the Gutenberg Bible, or you can see Shakespeare's first folio, as if, of course, to protect the fragility of the material page and the beautiful illumination of the text on the page. But essentially a book is meant to be read, and we can't read these books anymore because they have become just more than what they contain. They are things to look at as if through a glass. And so that always makes me feel a tiny bit sad. I don't know, there's a lot of loss in these poems, I think, because I wrote them in lockdown and I felt like this overwhelming sense, which I feel like many people have experienced in the last 18 months, of just how heavy the world can be and how the ways in which institutions are constructed to hold us isn't about our safety at all. It's about a kind of curation that privileges a certain stratification, and I'm not okay with that. So as a writer, as an activist, everything I do has to be about chipping away at that somehow, even if it means smashing the glass case and getting that book out and saying, turn the pages, read it again, read it carefully, look in the margins and see what's missing, see what's possible now.
And the TIDE Salon fragments do that so magnificently. The other thing that strikes me, and this is a rather perhaps selfish perspective in a sense, that as researchers, we struggle constantly with the claims of subjectivity and objectivity in our research. And here, the writing that you've produced catches us up midstream in that flow and weaves us into that tapestry. And as a part of the TIDE research team, I can kind of recognize those figures that flash past in that stream of text. I'm still not sure how I feel about it or how it makes me feel, but I wanted to hear your thoughts on how and why you wove our kind of fallible human agencies into your imagining of the fragments.
It feels to me a more honest way of presenting the work, because we can't, I don't think, when you look at We That Are Young, this material object, this book I have here, it doesn't show you the 10 years it took to write it and the drafts it went through and the notes and the kind of emotional journey that I went on to make the book. It shows you a finished art piece. And for me, I just felt with this, we had the potential to pay tribute to the work of the researchers that went into the TIDE project, because it's so intricate, and also try to examine, put that in the archive and write it in, so that in future, if somebody came across this piece in my imagination, they would say, okay, who is this person? Emilia, Lorraine, and Tom, and all these flashes of figures, the Revithy and the people who exist in the TIDE keywords and through the TIDE case studies, and pull at those threads and try to unravel some meaning from them. So I really wanted to weave all of that in. And Eliana, like you recognize parts of it because of your own knowledge, and I think that's really exciting because other people don't recognize those same bits. But if you, for example, know As You Like It, the play, very well, you'll know that Eliana comes from As You Like It and Celia comes from As You Like It. So there's this kind of play on this duality in Shakespeare, and yet the Shakespeareness of Shakespeare is lost in this archive, and by the time it gets to that point, and really, like, it's so personal. I'm trying to build something that whoever you are and however you come to it, something about it will resonate with you on some level, which only you can know. So you can make an intimate connection with the artwork that only belongs to you.
You're absolutely right. And it does. It resonates at different levels and at different moments when you look at it, juxtaposed particularly with all the other conversations among the writers and the artists that have gone on in the TIDE Salon. And I think that's one of the most wonderful things about the way you've devised it, going to the heart of the co-production of knowledge, in a way, the kind of working together at reaching for some understanding of both our pasts and our present. That's
right. And as a novelist, like, you work so much on your own, and yet you're surrounded by other people's learning, because you're drawing on so many different research books and articles and other people's solitary labors to make a book that's reliant on huge bibliographies. So it's sort of like, if you want to, this opportunity to acknowledge that collectivity and that collaboration that produces final piece of art felt really exciting in a different and unusual way for me to work, but a way which just made visible how I already work, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's wonderful, Preti. And I think it's time now perhaps to open up to a few questions from the audience, if you're happy to take some. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Q&A section of this session, the second event of TIDEfest, with Preti Taneja, the award-winning novelist and TIDE visiting writer in 2020. Preti, we've got a few questions that are coming up on our chat window here. The first one of these says, I'm delighted to hear Preti Taneja share her artistic and personal journeys with us today. I would like to return to your earlier discussion about how South Asian culture is at its best syncretic and with many cross-pollinations. I'm thinking of rich poetic traditions in Urdu and Hindi. Can you talk about some poets who have moved you particularly, and how you may generate further conversations between their works and perhaps even Shakespeare?
That's a great question. Thank you so much, whoever is asking that. And in my conversation earlier, I touched on Kabir, who I consider to be one of the foremost syncretic poets. And just the novel really is framed by Aravind Krishna Mehrotra's very modern translations of Kabir. And, they have this kind of brilliant sense of this thing that I've been talking about, this sense that everything is illusion, and everything we think we know is simply a kind of conceit. So time begins to feel like something that we can't win against, but also that doesn't control us. And that opens the doorway to really what I think of as the core of my version of Hinduism, which is that energy can never be created nor destroyed. And that is a kind of very liberating idea for me, and it's a generative idea. So Kabir is probably the first poet I would reference in that question. And obviously his poems, translated by Aravind Krishna Mehrotra, really do run through the novel. They happen in the Fool's Prophecies. They sort of voice bits of Shakespeare instead, pre-modern Shakespeare, if you like. Let's see now. I think we all grow up with Tagore in our homes, in our lives, and that sort of beautiful, poetic relationship to language and nature, as well as thinking about class through the stories and caste through the stories of Tagore, and then thinking about how those grew out of Tagore's own life and his relationships with women, which were very sad altogether. So really that forms quite a big part of how I think about poetry. And one of the main core moments of We That Are Young happens in the storm, when Jeet realizes and quotes this beautiful, very resonant line, and it's maybe I'll try and find it and we'll come back to it in the novel, which basically reads as worry about the country, native one, trouble is afoot, no one will remember you. I've added this part. No one will remember you even in stories, and it's taken from a 20th century Urdu poet, as well as Iqbal. And there are so many ways in which this poetic tradition has informed the way I think about time and language and mortality, in how putting it in conversation with Shakespeare really happened in We That Are Young. I'm not sure I can go back. I have to keep moving forward, but certainly these poets, they don't kind of get pulled off the shelf and then put into my work. They just are they're in DNA in a way, and they just come out. You can't help it. I don't think it's a good idea. I've had to do so much of my own close reading, so I know exactly, and I think I went through the fragments with you just now, and so you can see my workings in a way which I think is interesting for me, but obviously not for everyone else. Close reading is one of those things I think others should do at the end of the day, but if you do look at the work, you'll find relentless intertextuality with those poets, and I don't set out to do it. That's just how it comes out of my head.
It also makes me think, though, about conversations you and I have had in the past about the ways in which South Asian culture does not really make a very clear distinction between poetry, that is verbal and textual, and music, for instance, that there's such a close linking between the two, and conversation itself is at the heart of South Asian music quite often. The questioning and the answer, the response you seek is what drives South Asian music forwards.
I think that's a great point, and I think, I love that you remember these conversations. I feel like time has passed, my head's so stuffed full of different things, but it's wonderful to remember that was a very early decision for the kind of thing I wanted to do with the music and the spoken words, because the way you first encounter Indian or South Asian music and poetry is like a call and response, and you see this in wedding scenes in Bollywood, where the boys put a challenge to the girls in music and the girls answer back, and you can take it to the more literary level of different formal poetic traditions where there's a call to God, and then there's a response that gets made in wine, and so on and so on. So there's always a kind of conversation. There's always more than one person in the room, really, and usually one of them is divine. So that's always fun.
From one kind of conversation to another, actually, and this is about the conversation between history and fiction. We've got two questions that are kind of related, so I'll put them together. One of the questions is about our collaboration and about how true to life we can be about historical fragments, and whether and how scholars themselves need to come to terms with what we know or can't know about a life. And another question, which is kind of linked to this, and in the interests of full disclosure, comes from a TIDE team member. Thinking back again about your conversations with the whole team when we were talking to you about the micro-histories of lives that we had dug up, for instance, and what resonated with you when we were talking about those micro-histories and trying to struggle with those gaps, sometimes huge gaps that are left in the archives in finding out more about those lives.
So can you just remind me what the first question was, please, about the relationship between fiction and historians?
That's right. The relationship between history and fiction, how true to life we can be about historical fragments, and how scholars need to come to terms with what we know or can't know.
This is a really big question. I mean, my mind is going in so many different directions, and my kind of first response as a fiction writer is it's all fiction, because we just don't know why that particular fragment ended up in a particular place in the archive that it did. We don't know how important it was or not. Maybe someone just, needed to scribble something down, they tore a page they were writing on, and a bit of it went in the archive and the rest of it went in the bin. Who knows? And then 100 years later, someone gets this thing that says, Montaigne is an ass. And then suddenly you've got this whole war between these two poets. I don't know, I'm just making it up. And then, it also brings me to the question of Shakespeare studies, which is obsessed with the idea of who was Shakespeare and how can we know, and looking at the texts as finished items, which they are not. And they never were. They were always in evolution, right to the moment where they were spoken on the stage. And then again, when they were collected in print. And so, to think of this singular genius that formulated these works is sort of a fiction as well, because lots of hands had a go in editing, cutting, censoring, adding, and we tried to stay true to those plays as much as possible, but we can't. And Shakespeare himself borrowed from so many different sources and then added his own fictional gloss, historical sources, and then added the fictional gloss to make plays. So there is this very strong relationship between curation of history and making of fiction, which I think is fascinating. But I'm fairly firmly in the fiction writers' camp.
But it also goes back to what we were talking about, the challenges of dwelling in uncertainties, isn't it? And how uncomfortable that might be sometimes, how tempting it is to kind of reach out for that single, comforting single narrative in some ways.
Right. And for me now, as a fiction writer, that is not where I live. I am all about just living in the doubt of whatever it is fiction offers us. And, narrative forces us to pin stuff down in some ways. So we have to find ways around that. In the novel, I do it by setting these 5 young people's voices against each other in a kind of linear narrative, and it's offset by the Lear character who's sitting at a point in the future in a broken down house in Kashmir remembering, so he has the kind of circular narrative, and the two time codes fit together and swirl around each other, because I want to undermine that sense that we can only have one story all of the time. I just think that is the biggest lie we tell ourselves. And there's this wonderful line in Lear that Cordelia's eyes should comfort and not burn. And maybe that's what we think about art, that it should comfort us and not burn us. But I think burning is important because it's sort of way of saying, we can walk through this fire and we can come back again in a different form. And the form is more interesting to me than anything else.
And so much of what you have, inspired us to do in terms of TIDE Salon and in terms of the conversations is about engaging with that process of destruction in some ways. One question that has come up associated with that is the role of technology, the digital debris that keeps cropping up, that we're trying desperately to kind of retain in some ways in the TIDE Salon. And I wondered if you wanted to, we've got a few more minutes, so if you wanted to have a few final thoughts on that. I know we had multiple kind of sometimes slightly panicked conversations about how much we could capture of the conversations that our artists were having among themselves on various different forms of media.
Yeah, it's interesting because Ben Crow, who made the site, he is the person who curated what you see. So I didn't have that big a hand in what ended up being presented to the researcher who then finds the TIDE Salon and uses it, so whatever he decided was not going to go in it, didn't go in it, and I don't know what that is. But he does have a log, or Oxford University now has a log of all of that digital debris that he didn't use. Maybe we should find a way to give people another doorway into that if they were really, really obsessed with it.
But also in terms of the design from Ben, I think what was wonderful about the way he conceived of it is that sense of discovery. There's always a risk that as members of audience, you might click through on certain things and miss out on others. And that's part of the journey.
Right, that's life. And we have to be able to say, okay, I trust myself to make my own journey, and things I miss out on the way, I can't know what possibilities they would have offered me.
That moment of possibility and potential might be a really nice point for us to close this discussion. And I want to thank Preti again for opening up this journey for us, for making us pause on that very fruitful threshold, and for all of you for accompanying us on this journey. Don't forget to tune in for the remaining events of TIDEfest programs over this weekend. We have more conversations and writers and artists opening up whole new worlds in store. But for now, it's goodbye from me, Nandini Das, at the University of Oxford, and from Preti Taneja.
Thank you, Nandini, and everybody. It's been a real privilege to be with you today.